Good day, dear viewers. As always, we are happy to welcome you at the ALLATRA TV studio. Let me introduce our guests, who will help us understand and cover a very interesting topic, which we will voice a little further. Today we welcome Diana
Greetings.
and Evgeny.
Greetings.
The topic of our today's conversation is very interesting, and I believe it is really relevant to a lot of people, because, according to statistics, quite a lot of people suffer from such a syndrome as insomnia. To our surprise, it turned out that, on the one hand, this syndrome, or even this phenomenon, has been studied quite deeply, and in general, its symptomatology and consequences have been described in detail. There are even, let's call them so, supposedly effective ways of treating this disease. Nevertheless, a curious person always has a question: what is it? And most importantly, what are the causes of this disease? What to do with it? What specialist to address, and in what field to work with it? Therefore, our proposal today is addressed to all professionals. Let's try to look into these questions and find the answers to them using the knowledge given in the book ALLATRA. I will naturally have the first question for you. Before we proceed to the topic of insomnia, I would like to understand, in general, and probably for myself in the first place, what sleep is. Since we know that insomnia is a lack of sleep, meaning when a person cannot sleep normally, there is a certain halo around insomnia and sleep, which is based on physiological research, experiments, and some esoteric mysticism. Generally speaking, a lot of things are attributed to sleep, which probably shouldn't be there. Therefore, let's take our time and make it clear to our viewers and ourselves what sleep is, whether it is beneficial or maybe harmful, and let's proceed further. So, my first question is about physiological functions of sleep. How useful or even useless is it for a human? That's what I'd like to hear from you in the beginning.
Generally speaking, the situation and the topic is very interesting. It is also interesting because we spend a third of our lives sleeping. And this is such an area that actually, as Sasha said, has a certain halo of mysticism, misunderstanding, and it is underexplored. At the same time, despite all this, it has been studied for a relatively short time. If we look at the research of other topics related to human health and life, for some reason the subject of sleep was avoided for quite a long time. The first more or less significant scientific research appeared only in the middle of the last century, when electroencephalography was invented, and it became clear that it was possible to record electrical activity of the brain. Data were no longer subjective and became objective. Generally speaking, experts began to investigate various functions of the brain and surely didn't ignore the topic of sleep. Because a simple question arises. We spend a third of our lives lying somewhere, disconnected or not disconnected from something. And why is this? What is it for? Why was it invented by nature or created by the Almighty Lord, and so on? What is it given for? Yet, the fact that it is physiological and given to a human being from the very beginning is undeniable and undoubted, and we cannot argue with that. Although some specialists try to argue that sleep is an acquisition of our civilization, they try to reason that people used to sleep differently in the past. A human slept intermittently like some animals, being in a half-asleep state, ready for certain actions. However, experience and research show that it is still a physiological process. And the question arises, what is it for? When you have the keys to understanding, Basically, everything gets in its order and becomes clear. But let us touch a little on the twists and turns of scientific studies that exist around this issue in order to understand what the scientific community is thinking about it and in what direction they are trying to move. On that basis, we will understand where the truth is, where lies are, and what is actually happening.
Okay.
I hope this program will bring us to a real understanding of what the essence of sleep is, what it is given for, and what is happening to the human body and consciousness in general while a person is sleeping. However, for a general introduction to sleep that we will need later on, I will say that sleep is not a single continuous process. It has certain stages and phases. This point will also be important for us later when we deal with all the issues related to sleep and insomnia. Sleep is generally divided into two major stages: a stage of slow-wave sleep and a stage of REM sleep, which differ in the activity of a person's eye movements during sleep. The stage of slow-wave sleep also consists of several stages. The four main stages, which successively supersede each other. At the very beginning, when a person falls asleep, the activity of his brain is inhibited. A person gradually plunges into a state of slumber. There may occur hypno-like pictures that resemble hallucinations, and a person begins to doze. Brain activity decreases, and a person begins to fall asleep. It's quite a short period of time, and normally it can last for about 5 to 10 minutes. Next, he already moves to the second phase of sleep, when brain activity slows down even more, and he may experience some dreams. The activity of the brain and the body as a whole is inhibited. Breathing slows down. Heart rate is reduced. Electroencephalography shows that the activity rhythm also decreases. The so-called sleep spindles appear. These are, let's say, clusters of electrical activity in the brain when it is a little agitated. Then it becomes a little bit suppressed. It's important to understand that this second phase of sleep allows a person to wake up without any, so to say, negative consequences for himself.
A more sensitive state of sleep is preserved, right?
I mean, on the one hand, yes, more sensitive. It means a person goes deeper into sleep, but at the same time, there are such periods when he floats up, so to say, and is able to hear what is happening around him and so on, and he can wake up. Basically, this second phase of sleep is the most favorable for awakening. If a person is not awakened, he will go into a deeper sleep. These are the third and the fourth stages of sleep which supersede one another, and this is when a deep inhibition of brain functions occur, when in general, a deeper inhibition of all body functions take place. A person is in a state of rest, his eyeballs don't move, and he plunges into a deep sleep. Electrical activity of the brain also changes. Both the third and the fourth stages of sleep are transitional. This is considered to be the so-called delta sleep, when brain activity is very slow, but some interesting points take place. Let me digress a little from the topic of sleep to the topic of electroencephalography in people who are in meditative practices. There is a very interesting point. These phases of sleep, the third and the fourth phases, when the so-called delta sleep takes place, are very similar, almost the same, to the electrical activity of the brain that is observed in people who are in a deep meditative state. When a research was carried out during Zen practices in Buddhists or deep meditation states in yogis, at the moment when this electrical activity was observed, which equals to deep sleep, they said that they felt liberation. They had the so-called state of samadhi, when they had not just a meditative practice, but a deep spiritual practice. That's a very interesting point indeed. Subsequently, the phase of slow-wave sleep passes into the next phase, the phase of the so-called REM sleep. which is characterized by an increased brain activity and by fairly active movements of eyeballs. Why do I once again focus on the eyeballs? Because there have been numerous studies repeated with a certain frequency which show that these eyeball movements are identical to moments when a person studies new pictures or new information, when he sees new images, when a person doesn't just look at some objects but tries to scrutinize or examine them. This means that a person is looking at something with increased attention. And in fact, during this phase of sleep, it is most often observed that,
Excuse me, it turns out that he's looking in the same way as when he scrutinizes something while awake, right? Because this phase of rapid eye movement, REM sleep, is very interesting. For a very long time, by the degree of brain activity, it could not be distinguished from the phase of wakefulness. So the brain activity is very similar. And what you're saying now...
right, yes, this is a very interesting point. And it's also interesting because in the study of electrophysiology of brain functions in cold-blooded animals, this phase of REM sleep corresponds to the active phase of their life. Thus, while being awake, the cold-blooded have brain activity identical to the brain activity of a human during the phase of REM sleep. The largest number of dreams occur exactly in the phase of REM sleep. Dreams are often paradoxical and completely illogical, and they always have quite a big emotional coloring.
You've said that dreams are illogical, and I thought about this phase as well. Actually, these dreams are very bright, exactly those which a person most often remembers. But if you ask him to retell these dreams, a person is unable to. He tries to combine some images which are often from a completely different dream. I mean, this phase of sleep, REM sleep, shows how illogical consciousness is. It is far from being logical. Why else did I start thinking about this? When we learn to observe it and take notes of these flaws of thoughts, this illogicality of consciousness becomes evident as well. I got the following analogy. Consciousness is illogical. It simply throws some images and thoughts, while we think that we are consistent and logical, obeying it. Whereas such moments enable us to see that it is just a flow of information to which a person reacts in one way or another.
The most amazing thing, as some experts in psychology and psychiatry say, is that they try to explain this illogicality in some way.
Yes, of course, many try to explain it. There is a whole theory based on this. Interpretation of dreams according to Freud. Generally speaking, it's an attempt to explain something that merely represents pictures which take, attract, and hold attention. Zhenya has just said that a person scrutinizes them. And these pictures, these images surround us all the time. Consciousness constantly captures us through images.
This is really so. Why? Because the phase of REM sleep not only attracts the attention of a sleeping person himself, but there are lots of various mystical views and theories about this phase, and a great number of diverse practices have been invented in order to use this phase of sleep. But as a matter of fact, it turns out that it's a trivial game of consciousness, a virtually illogical and completely incoherent movie is shown to you only in order to provoke a huge flow of emotions, nothing more. Because most often, as Diana correctly says, when people wake up, they don't remember a dream itself, but they certainly remember this emotional trail which remains after it. And this emotional trail often influences the entire further day. Thus, a person not only experiences these pictures, these images, and this emotional state, but during the day, his consciousness may from time to time return him to pondering over it and trying to link it to some kind of logic. Against this background, lots of various predictions, fortune-telling, and so on are constructed. And it leads to the point that a person automatically begins to adjust his life to this. But what for? Why should we do it if we can live a normal and full life? Why should we bind ourselves to something that our own consciousness has presented to us in a dream? especially taking into account that it's atypical and illogical, and some people try to tie it to the experience which a person has had during the day. Again, to what? To emotions. What else is this phase of REM sleep characterized by? Besides the fact that it causes such stormy emotions, it can also become longer from one sleep episode to another. In addition to what I've said about sleep stages, it should be noted that if a person is not woken up during the phase of REM sleep, I mean when being in this state, he hasn't woken up due to those emotions or fears that he experienced in his sleep, and that could have woken him up by causing some kind of stress, he goes back to the phase of slow-wave sleep. He skips the first phase of falling asleep, goes into the second stage of slow-wave sleep, and the cycle repeats again. The total duration of such a cycle is about 90 to 100 minutes. It is quite individual, but on average it takes about 90 minutes. These phases are normally repeated 4, 5, or 6 times. In this case, a person gets enough sleep, he wakes up refreshed, and thereafter everything is fine with this person. Yet, what happens if a person sleeps less than he's supposed to? If a person sleeps less than necessary, certain processes taking place in the body don't reach their completion. What processes those are? It's an interesting question because we can consider them from the standpoint of official science. We can talk about the viewpoint of medicine as a part of mainstream science, or we can talk about the viewpoint of the scientific community that covers broader fields. Let's say quantum physics and so on. There are lots of interesting views, a great number of interesting perspectives, but they all line up in the same chain. Generally, we can say that sleep is necessary to restore the functions of a physical body. During sleep, certain hormonal shifts and changes occur that lead to the improvement of metabolism in the body. Regeneration takes place. The processes of catabolism, meaning destruction, are inhibited, whereas anabolic processes, meaning the processes of construction, are activated. This is especially expressed in little children who sleep a lot, and anabolism is very significant for them to grow up big and healthy. These are the changes that occur in the body. Moreover, the following has to be mentioned. If we consider sleep from the standpoint of practical medicine, why is it important to understand? Because there are many views concerning anabolic therapy, which is necessary to improve and restore body functions, and is significant in case of certain diseases or for prevention of some illnesses. Why is it so important? Because when such medications are prescribed as chondroprotectors, hepatoprotectors, or cardioprotectors, most often doctors prescribe them depending on the phases of nutrition, meaning before or after meals. However, they often forget that there are also phases of sleep, which affect the processes of anabolism and catabolism in the body.
Much more significantly.
Yes, much more significantly.
Wait a minute. I would like to clarify something. There is a certain group of medications, such as various protectors. As I understand it, Zhenya, from what you have said, it is important to take them, considering the indication of sleep, meaning without taking into account what a person ate or drank, whether he had any activity or not. How are these medications related to the process of sleep? And also, I would like to understand. I don't know what kind of medications those are or what they are for, but I know that protectors are meant to protect something. So, do they protect anything in our body?
To protect and to restore.
Right. And what does this mean? Well, this question is for you, Zhenya, as a person working in this field. If a specialist, a doctor, doesn't take into account these points which you are talking about, that occur during the sleep, such as catabolism,
Even simpler, Sasha. If a doctor doesn't take into account whether a person suffers from insomnia or not, one of the very important mechanisms of protection and recovery is broken. Roughly speaking, the body is being repaired during sleep. All the breakdowns accumulated during the day are being restored at night, precisely during the phase of deep sleep. So if this phase of sleep is broken, then medications like cardioprotectors and chondroprotectors will not function effectively. It's impossible because they're based on the anabolic recovery processes. This is a very important factor for these medications to work, and it's very important to consider. Yet what recommendations are usually taken into account? As Zhenya has said, before or after a meal, these are the standards. However, as of today, one of the first signs which appear right before another exacerbation of a mental state or development of a mental illness in general is precisely insomnia. It's an obvious symptom that immediately draws attention to itself. When it takes place, that's it. Here comes a mental disorder. Moreover, nowadays, for example, many doctors and studies, we don't have enough studies that could show a connection between insomnia and the development of some somatic or neurological diseases. Not only are they insufficient, but there are very few of them. For example, there are studies confirming that the risk of hypertension is increased 1.5 or more times in people who suffer from insomnia. It also contributes to increased insulin resistance, which may lead to the development of diabetes. Yet a more detailed research is difficult to find. However, many researching physicians already wonder if insomnia isn't often the cause of many somatic or neurological diseases. After all, today, the causes of insomnia are unknown. It belongs to a series of symptoms, syndromes, and diseases when it is said the etiology of this disease is unknown, right? More often than not. And when a person suffers from a serious chronic disease, and there are such symptoms in this disease as, for instance, a pronounced pain syndrome or respiratory failure, which is more severe during sleep, they immediately say, well, that's why he has insomnia, because there is this disease. So today, many doctors already think, isn't it the other way around? Perhaps this insomnia, which has lasted for years, has led to the development of this disease in a person. Just so far, there's not much research in this direction.
I see.
That's what it's about.
Okay, thank you. Zhenya, I have a question to continue this topic. Diana has said, and you have mentioned, that a human body is recovering during sleep. Has any research been done in this field, and is there any evidence to that? Because there are many expressions. Sleep is the best remedy is one of them, and there are doctors' recommendations in healthcare, in sports, and even in kindergarten. Today you have mentioned children that there is a certain period of time when a child's body should be sleeping. A body which becomes overloaded with intensive physical and mental work. In such a case, what is the benefit of sleep? And is there any information supporting that?
Well, it's a very interesting question. On the one hand, there is a straight answer. Yes, of course, everyone knows about this. Ask any doctor what he thinks, whether sleep helps a person to recover, and he will answer you, yes, it helps. But when you ask where is evidence, besides the fact that we just know that it works, most often you won't hear anything back. If we go deeper, this subject has actually been studied quite interestingly. It was studied at the molecular level, and a very interesting picture shows up. If we consider sleep in general, all the phases that I have talked about, a human body behaves differently during different phases, and recovery doesn't occur in all phases of sleep. Restoration of the body takes place precisely during deep sleep, when a person is, roughly speaking, completely turned off. That's when restoration of tissues takes place. Thus a question arises. What is the basis for restoration of tissues? It is generally accepted that restoration of the functions of tissues and organs is based on DNA functioning. That's where our genetic material is stored, and it is recorded there what the normal body condition should be. Correspondingly, when a person falls asleep, the genetic code is read, and on this basis the restoration process takes place. Yet, there's one big but. In our everyday life, this genetic material also gets damaged. During the day, under the influence of various factors, under the influence of various adverse conditions, it becomes damaged. At that, DNA restoration also takes place during the phase of slow-wave sleep. Besides, it is interesting that supposedly this process should take place uninterruptedly. However, there are scientific studies proving that it takes place exactly during sleep. Quite an interesting experiment was conducted in Israel. Researchers studied semi-transparent fish that were easy to examine with a microscope. Since their tissues are quite transparent, it was possible to see the DNA structure of these fish with a powerful microscope, and it became clear that the DNA of these fish was being restored exactly in the state of sleep, meaning when they were sleeping. Restoration also occurred during the day, but it was minor restoration that, generally speaking, might not be taken into account, while DNA restoration took place particularly during sleep. This is a very important point. Why? Because from the standpoint of biophysics and biology, DNA restoration is crucial. Why? Because more studies were conducted regarding the interaction between human DNA and the outside world. These are also interesting studies which were carried out in the 1990s. The first study was conducted by Russian researchers jointly with the Institute of Biophysics in California, where they examined the influence of DNA on the outside world. Later on, this study was repeated many times. To describe it briefly, the idea was that they took a vacuum and determined the position of photons in it. They were located chaotically. Then a human DNA was placed into this vacuum. After that, the position of photons became well ordered. They took a certain position. This is 100% proof that the appearance of DNA in a vacuum influences the structure of photons, meaning the world around. Moreover, after the DNA was removed, the structure remained the same. I mean, photons didn't begin moving chaotically again, but they remained in the same order that was formed with the presence of DNA. Therefore, not only the DNA affected the position of photons itself, but it also prolonged the well-ordered position of photons. This means that DNA not only affects
An energy trace.
Yes, it's an energy trace. And even such a term as photon DNA appeared. It's very important. This means that the state of DNA affects the world around. Moreover, a series of studies were conducted after that. Military personnel was mostly involved, as it most often happens at first. Fortunately, it didn't do them any harm. A similar experiment was held in the United States. A soldier's DNA, a scrape from his cheek, was taken and placed in the next room. They installed appropriate devices that could monitor the state of DNA, and the tested person was offered to watch movies with certain pictures, ranging from violence at warfare to some comedy or erotic scenes. Thus, the man's emotional state was changing accordingly, and the DNA structure was also changing in accordance with his emotional state. However, they didn't stop there. The DNA material was moved more than 350 miles away from the tested person, and they began not only to bring the tested person to a certain emotional state, but also started tracing the moment when an emotional state appeared and his DNA started changing. They traced it by means of a nuclear clock, trying to detect fractions of a second. And the paradox was that there was no time interval. As soon as a change in the emotional state of the tested person occurred, there was an instant change in the state of his DNA structure. Of course, this was described quite well in physics long ago. It is known as the effect of entangled particles. And this is another confirmation of how much our emotions can instantly influence the world around us.
Here's the basic essence of psychosomatics.
Right.
Emotions destroy and cause diseases.
Well, Zhenya, thank you for the information you are providing. In fact, guys, look, we started with the topic of sleep. We began to analyze the physiology of sleep, talk about biological and chemical processes that occur in the body, and now we have already approached physics. I mean, how much everything is interconnected. And I should say that this interconnection was traceable in the past. Yet, what is happening in science nowadays? Perhaps some scientists are in contact with others in certain related areas, but each of them works separately. Yet, what has been said in the book *ALLATRA*, that everything is really interconnected, and one thing results from another. And what you have just voiced, all these experiments confirm this. DNA research. As I remember from the school course of biology, DNA is, first of all, information.
Right.
How much information affects our material, roughly manifested world, which all of us feel. Many people believe that it's the only reality that exists.
This gives a much more complete picture. I'm listening to Zhenya, how much more comprehensive understanding is given through interaction between sciences, exchange of information, and interconnection. We're all separated. In healthcare, everything is divided into different branches, and often a human being can no longer be integrated into a single whole organism. While this gives a complete comprehensive picture and a totally different understanding, how important it is to unite all sciences and focus on what is essential to study.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And from this perspective, it's very interesting to look at another DNA study. It was also held in the 1990s. It was conducted by Heart Math Institute. Do you hear how it sounds? Heart Math Institute. There was a study similar to this one. The influence of emotions on DNA. They took the DNA of placenta, it is the main building material for the formation of a human body, which hasn't yet undergone any rough changes. This material was placed in separate containers where DNA condition could also be recorded, and people who performed the experiment were asked to evoke certain emotions in themselves. That is, they were first trained to evoke one or another emotion in themselves. And it was also very interesting to observe how the DNA structure was changing. Being at a distance, by evoking certain emotional changes in his state, an experimenter provoked changes not even in his DNA, but in DNA of the placenta, meaning in the DNA that doesn't belong to him. Yet, the most interesting thing was that when there were negative emotions, the DNA twisted as if being compressed, and the work of certain parts of the DNA slowed down and got blocked. And on the contrary, when emotions were positive, meaning it wasn't just joy, but the joy accompanied by a sense of goodness and love, then the structure of DNA changed in a completely different way, became more stretched, less compressed, and there was an activation of those parts of the DNA that had been previously blocked. Moreover, a similar experiment was carried out on people with HIV infection. The most interesting thing is that these feelings of love and goodness increased the defensive forces of a human body that suffered from HIV infection by 300,000 times, not by one time, not 2 or 3 times, but 300,000 times. What does this indicate?
The healing power of love.
The healing power of love. And now let's go back to the topic of sleep. What happens to us in the phase of REM sleep? We experience emotions, and these emotions tend to be negative. These are often worries.
Fear.
It is often fear and stress. These are attempts to avoid some kind of disasters. It's an attempt to prove self-significance somewhere. It's a fight with someone. We argue. We fight with somebody. It can often be a murder that we commit in our sleep, which we wouldn't even think of in our real life. This emotional response definitely has a negative impact on the DNA structure. And another interesting question arises. There are studies showing that not only a lack of sleep affects health and the length of a person's life, but so does too much sleep. Too much sleep affects the length of life as well. And some studies claim that even to a greater extent. A person's life shortens if he sleeps more than necessary. It has been proven that if a person sleeps more than 9 hours, his health progressively gets worse. So maybe the essence of the problem is hidden here. It turns out that the period of REM sleep increases from one phase of sleep to another. The period of slow-wave sleep decreases, while REM sleep increases. The phase of slow-wave sleep shortens when restoration of DNA functions and restoration of the body takes place, while the phase when we experience heavy emotions becomes longer.
Where distraction takes place.
Where destruction takes place. So it turns out that too much sleep leads to a damage of DNA structure. And what does this lead to? It leads to chronic diseases. It can lead to oncology, and so on. Life expectancy decreases.
This is simple. A person even feels it when he sleeps too long. He thinks, I will go back to sleep for a little longer, and wakes up feeling worse. Headache, apathy, attention deficit, and reduced working efficiency. It affects immediately, and people feel it.
Yes, they feel it.
They confirm it.
And again, studies show that the more a person sleeps, the more fears, negative emotions, and nightmares he experiences, particularly during sleep.
There is a good comment to this topic. If we turn to religion, particularly to Christianity and to the scriptures of Holy Fathers, they tell quite well and clearly about sleep. There was quite an interesting piece of information. If a novice didn't wake up early in the morning, when there were wake-up calls, and he kept sleeping for various reasons, due to tiredness or some unpleasant feelings in his body, and he forgot and went back to sleep, then Holy Fathers would say, "You didn't sleep more, but a demon lay down on you." If we draw parallels, then many...
What did they call demons?
Yes, many people think that religion has nothing to do with science. There is such a good science as psychology, and it can explain all these processes. There has been research conducted which, on the contrary, confirms these simple words, that exactly these images...
For sure. Images and thoughts are what were called demons.
They came to a person, tormented him, and made him worried, right?
Yes.
Everyone knew that, but expressed it in different words, and they knew it without any research.
Let's take, for instance, sleep, okay? After all, the state of dreaming and various things that come true in it, plus dictation, when a person manipulates and controls a lucid controlled dream. After all, what is this in fact? It's the influence of secondary consciousness when the critical component of primary consciousness is weakened, and secondary one begins to create God knows what kind of conditions. In a dream, a person might be anyone of the other gender and perceiving himself completely differently as an absolutely real thing, and all the mess and implausible stuff is perceived as absolutely logical, absolutely natural, and a person doesn't even experience rejection when, pardon me, for example, water flows not downward but uphill. This is okay. When there is no gravity, he flies and he knows how to fly, and this is normal. This is experience. Many people wonder, how come I pushed off in my dream and I flew? I know how to fly. Does this mean a human can fly? Pardon me. Where does information come from, my friends? From the system, meaning from secondary consciousness. The system knows how to fly. For instance, a bird flies, and all this is the system. Naturally, this experience is applied and transmitted. Just as a bird flies up, knowing and understanding in the same way, this knowledge and understanding comes to you in a dream. Because a dream is a dream. It's a work of secondary consciousness. And we again go back to Freud and all the rest who tried to decipher. What does it mean? Nothing at all. They are messing with your head.
In a dream.
In dreams, sure, this is brain work. They tried to hypothesize something. It gives something somewhere. It works in some way, but in fact, nothing works. It's hard to make consciousness work even during sleep. It is possible. You can discipline it. And during sleep, when you are asleep, it does some work and then gives you necessary information. However, you need to discipline it for that. You need to work very hard on that. While when it manipulates you and you work for it, for the system, and for consciousness, then to expect from it that it will give you something good is stupid and unreasonable. It's just a waste of time and effort and an additional feeding of the system itself at your loss.
Actually, I have found that in America, there were a lot of studies on various subjects. And here's one of those studies by the University of Pennsylvania in particular. They took about 50 people, healthy men and women, divided them into 4 groups, and during 2 weeks, depending on the sleep mode, which was determined for each group, they monitored the changes in their well-being, health, and various physical indicators. They took one group of people who were supposed to stay awake for 3 days and observed what would happen to them. The second group of people had to sleep no more than 4 hours a day for 2 weeks. The third group slept no more than 6 hours a day, while the fourth group slept 8 hours a day. Here are the interesting conclusions and observations they arrived at. After 2 weeks, the group of people who slept for 6 hours a day had almost no differences in physical disorders from the group of people who slept 4 hours a day. Thus, not enough sleep and insufficient recovery, which were accumulated, caused relevant disorders. An interesting observation was made that in the beginning, people who didn't have enough sleep, they slept 4 or 6 hours, noticed how it affected their well-being. They noticed that their productivity and concentration of attention were decreasing. They experienced general weakness and fatigue. They really noticed these changes. However, just 3 or 4 days later, although the worsening of their condition continued to increase, people didn't notice it themselves.
Criticism was decreasing.
Right. Therefore, it turns out that with lack of sleep, we don't notice a decrease in these cognitive functions. And there's another interesting paradox. People often want to work more in order to get more done, to earn more money, right? They extend their working hours. Yet it has also been discovered that at the same time, people's working performance is reduced approximately 2 or 3 times. So it makes no sense. It has been calculated how many billions of dollars are lost because of these workaholics who try to work longer.
It's an obvious consumer approach.
Yes, but it's ineffective. Therefore, it's better to follow the sleep and rest routine. Interestingly, another experiment was conducted with basketball players at Stanford University. They were offered to sleep not less than 10 hours for 5 weeks. On average, they slept 8 hours a day, which was their mandatory norm. By the end of the experiment, it was noticed that their accuracy of throws increased, while the time of sprint decreased, meaning their physical performance increased several times just because their sleep had been prolonged with such intense physical activity. Their bodies began to recover better and faster. So this is a significant point, but we know that. For example, there are statistics that people who have insomnia are 5 times more likely to be involved in road traffic accidents. The number of accidents at work increases because people lose their working ability. Many cognitive functions are disrupted, which prevents a person from being attentive. Let's just imagine the state of a person after one sleepless night. What does he experience? Headache, exhaustion, weakness, tiredness. He doesn't want anything. He's irritated. The predominant emotion is irritation. A person is irritated by everything because he has one dominant thought that he focuses on.
To have a
I
rest.
wish it would be over soon. I want to go to bed and get some sleep. It turns out that when consciousness provokes the state of insomnia in a person, yet what is a dominant thought? Is control of consciousness over a person. Consciousness deprives a person of sleep. We have mentioned that these images and thoughts don't let a person fall asleep. By depriving him of sleep, consciousness in this way strengthens its power over him during the daytime. And when a person starts thinking, I wish this day would be over soon, all I want to do is to sleep, but it's a whole day of life. And what if there are many such days? Yet there are a lot of people who don't sleep for years. That's how human life is just taken away. That's how it happens.
It's also notable that we are talking about the United States, where sleep issues have been studied very well. I'd like to emphasize two interesting points. A study was conducted on response abilities among drivers. It was noticed that the ability to react to a road traffic situation of drivers who haven't slept for 17 or 19 hours is almost the same as that of a person with alcohol intoxication. At the same time, the dosage of alcohol intoxication, according to the alcohol content in blood, is about 0.05 per ml, which is the maximum permissible dosage in the United States. In some states, it is up to 0.08 per ml, but it's a couple of more hours without sleep, and that will be exactly the same. Therefore, insomnia affects a person to such an extent that his ability to perceive and react to the world around him changes drastically, and his condition may be described as a state of intoxication. And many researchers confirm that a person who has experienced a certain period of insomnia is basically in the same state as a person who has either alcohol or drug intoxication. He has hallucinations, a certain retardation of functions, reactions, and so on. And it's quite a serious thing. If we talk about labor productivity, it is also notable, and not just in the United States. For example, when I was in China at quite a big manufacturing company that operates for almost the entire world, I came across the fact that there were folding beds in factory shops. I asked what for. They answered everyone is supposed to take a nap from midday to 1 p.m. I said, well, China, there, I apologize, people are forced to work to the limit of their capabilities in order to be as efficient as possible. Their management says, no, pardon us,
They won't be effective, right?
they won't work as effectively and won't have such accuracy if they don't sleep. We have calculated this a long time ago. They are supposed to sleep, and it is mandatory for them to have a daytime nap. This indicates a lot because accuracy, attentiveness, and productivity thus increase.
We have just talked about what physiological sleep is, what a huge benefit it has for the body, right?
Yes,
Because everyone associates sleep, first of all, with body rest. We talked about the fact that sleep is an altered state of consciousness. It is an altered state of consciousness, but a person is not a body.
and here,
A human being is not consciousness. After all, a human being is a personality, a spiritual being. And now it's very important and interesting. It's very important and interesting to me to figure out what sleep is for personality and whether personality sleeps at all. How important is physiological sleep for personality, my true self, as well as its disorder when sleep is suddenly interrupted? Of course, I would like to figure this out because, in my opinion, it's more valuable and important. We can find answers to these questions in the books by Anastasia Novik. Igor Mikhailovich also gives these answers in the videos with his participation. And the first video, which I recall in this connection, is live. Maybe let's listen to a fragment from this video together.
So how can a person simply realize during the day that he's a spirit and see a spirit in another person?
Well, a person should first of all realize that he is not quite matter and has a spiritual nature as well. Then both during the day and during sleep, he will be spiritual.
During sleep?
And what's the difference? If we take the work of consciousness, there are surely phases of awakening, falling asleep. But if we consider the actual process, consciousness starts dominating personality at the moment of awakening, and then the dream phase takes place. It's when such a connection occurs, so to say. Yet when a person is in deep sleep, this connection takes place and personality gains freedom, and it can stay with no influence of consciousness for a certain while. And a person doesn't remember this state. Why doesn't he remember? Because consciousness is switched off, disconnected, although personality cannot sleep. Whereas if a person is aware of himself as a spiritual being and begins to feel, let's say, that he isn't just an animal, but is a part of something greater and boundless, to put it carefully, then he can control sleep and he can control everything. In other words, he doesn't submit to consciousness as such. It's consciousness that submits to him.
Now, after these explanations, it becomes clear what kind of awakening is mentioned in various spiritual traditions. Why are people often told, wake up from sleep? Finally, it has become clear. By the way, many people themselves say this, but they don't dare because they're afraid. Probably something is wrong with me. There are people who admit it. They say, I live like in a dream and have a strange feeling that I'm like a robot, like in some automatic mode. Is this weird? No, that is, people actually feel that the state of sleep for personality is a completely different thing. It turns out that the state of sleep for personality is when it is under the total control of consciousness without even being aware of who it actually is. To this day, the causes of insomnia have not been clarified, as we have said. How did they try to deal with it? They studied how the brain works, first of all, what changes occur in the body and in the brain in the first place. However, they didn't receive any answer. Therefore, let's try to search for answers based on their understanding of the true nature of a human being, on the knowledge of what personality is, what consciousness is, how they interact, and how they're related. Thus, we will try to look for answers relying on the truth.
Indeed, we have analyzed the benefits of physiological sleep for a human body. A very good comment, after all, is about the fact that a human being is not a body, and he is not consciousness. And the state of sleep, in which personality abides here, in three-dimensionality, I think that will also help a lot to our viewers. Because for me personally, until the moment when we began to discuss this topic, it was unclear. Yes, I knew what the activity of consciousness was, and I knew what sleep was. Nevertheless, being aware of myself as personality, I always had a question. What does this three-dimensionality mean to me? Igor Mikhailovich once said very well that a dream is an illusion. And you realize that in this three-dimensionality, you are as if in an illusion. You understand that this whole world is illusory, and for you, as a spiritual being, it is a dream which you have to wake up from.
Sasha, and this illusion is created for personality by consciousness itself. As for sleep, during the deep phase of physiological sleep, there is a disconnection of personality from consciousness, meaning liberation from consciousness. Therefore, physiological sleep is very important for personality. A person should pass all the stages, and most importantly, the phase of deep sleep should not be missed in any way. It's very important.
Yes, thank you for that. It is very important because our audience might come up with a question, just like myself. How does personality benefit from it? And now you have answered that personality has an opportunity to get liberated from the influence of consciousness in the phase of deep sleep. Indeed, continuing our conversation today, we have clarified the main significant points regarding sleep. We are getting close to insomnia. It is interesting and important to note that the phenomenon of insomnia itself has no detailed and clear explanation. I mean, no one can pinpoint the reasons for it. They blame either an illness, or fatigue, or stress, or something else. Even if we look at the list of causes, what has surprised me very much is a sedentary lifestyle. Guys, pardon me. Does this mean that 90% of the population on the Earth or in megacities are subject to insomnia today?
By and large, yes.
Just because we have a sedentary lifestyle. The most amazing thing is, you should agree that insomnia as a phenomenon, when we were starting and preparing for this program, we found that people had been tortured with insomnia.
Yes, it was one of the most terrible and most painful tortures.
And executions too.
Right, executions as well.
So it was not just torture, it was an execution.
Yes, one of the cruelest executions.
Hence, it not only leads to diseases or mental disorders, but it leads to death.
So, as they say, attention guys, a lack of sleep leads to death. What should be pointed out? Just pay attention to what has been said. Sleep is an opportunity for personality to liberate itself from the influence of consciousness, while insomnia is a product of the system, a product of consciousness.
It's the activity of secondary consciousness.
Yes, the system knows very well that sleep is a life-saving breath of air for personality, although it may still be sleeping. As Igor Mikhailovich says, even if it is bullied by this consciousness, by these dogs, sleep is an opportunity for it to breathe, to touch with freedom at least for a moment. And I will repeat and emphasize that consciousness mercilessly, ruthlessly deprives a person of sleep in all possible and accessible ways. The toxicity of consciousness towards personality is absolutely obvious, and sleep deprivation is one of such confirmations.
Let's look at what types of sleep disorders exist. A person may have difficulty falling asleep. He may have frequent night awakenings, and one of the options is exactly lack of a sense of rest when sleep quality deteriorates. For example, sleep becomes more superficial with frequent dreams. The phase of REM sleep predominates at night. Then there is daytime drowsiness, which is also a sleep disorder. Now let's take a look at the way these disorders happen. How does the process of sleep actually occur? How do we enter sleep, and how does it start? We enter sleep through images. Everything begins with a light drowsiness, hallucination-like dreams, and some kind of fantasies. I mean, there is a flow of pictures first. They can be taken from the person's day, or it's just a flow of all kinds of images. Very often, when a person is falling asleep, some ideas appear. The person has been racking his brain for a long time, and suddenly he finds the solution, and it kind of prompts him to get up and start solving this problem. Thus, the phase of falling asleep is the phase of activity of secondary consciousness. And how do we come out of sleep? Through images as well. The phase of REM sleep, Zhenya, it is what you were talking about, high brain activity. And not just high brain activity, but high cortical activity. The cerebral cortex is also called the visual brain. I usually tell people how consciousness works is first we receive images, then thoughts which correspond to these images, then corresponding emotions and desires are formed. And only then a person makes a decision to act in a particular way. However, a lot of people start objecting. No, it's not like that. I have thoughts but no pictures. But that's impossible. Our brain functions this way. The cerebral cortex is the first to perceive information from primary consciousness. That's why it is called the visual cortex, because it functions through images. High activity of the cerebral cortex occurs during REM sleep, and we see these vivid dreams. It is through them that a person wakes up. Yet, how does it usually happen? This is what you, Zhenya, have said. It's the activity of eyeballs. When a person is very interested, he cannot tear himself away. We feel that we're no longer asleep. And what kind of dreams are those usually? Most often, we wake up in anxiety and fear, especially if we wake up at night. By the way, night awakenings, which cause insomnia, most often occur during REM sleep, and if a person wakes up during it, he cannot fall asleep anymore because high activity of secondary consciousness remains. That's what people say. I woke up and didn't even understand why I woke up. Some anxiety, fear, there was something I was dreaming about, and then I couldn't fall asleep again. Why can't you fall asleep? There are some thoughts. I recall something, then something else. One woman shared, even thoughts are strange. I've already thought about everything, and then it begins. Maybe you should go to the bathroom again, or maybe get something to eat or drink. She says, I just want to lie down, wrap up in a blanket, and fall asleep. No, these thoughts start driving a person so actively in a circle. It's the activity of secondary consciousness. That's why people, and most often children, describe it very well. Nowadays, there are a lot of complaints about children's insomnia, and it is observed in children of different ages, starting from a young age, 3 and 4 years old, and up to teenagers. And children, especially little ones, describe it very clearly. They're scared. They wake up in fear because the topics of dreams are most often about what happened during the day. The most common ones are sex and fear. These topics give us the most vivid pictures in consciousness. Most often, we wake up because of fear, since all dreams end with some nightmares.
Yes, but it is also worth mentioning, since we have discussed the working mechanisms of consciousness. And let's just remind our viewers why. Why does consciousness benefit from intimidation? Why does it benefit from temptation? And what has been discussed today, these bright emotions which it provokes. Because this is its food.
Yes, they take the greatest deal of energy. The emotion of fear is one of the strongest.
I mean, ruthlessly, people are just being ruthlessly eaten during the day and during the night. No rest, no respite. Consciousness, as they say, is a raging, hungry dog that won't let you go until it eats you up. This has to be understood, guys.
Even if we look at how science explains it, some modern theories explaining insomnia. First of all, the main mechanism that scientists pay attention to is high-frequency brain activity in a person even during the day, which leads to insomnia. Namely, it's a high activity of the cerebral cortex, meaning the dominant activity of secondary consciousness both during the day and at night. The only question here is what launches it. Does insomnia trigger this mechanism of the activity of secondary consciousness, or does it happen during the day? Because consciousness prepares a person from about midday, and a person is constantly focused on thoughts. People often say, it gets terrible. When I think about the upcoming night, I already experience horror, fear, anxiety, and everything together. And he constantly thinks about it, meaning it becomes the main dominant problem on which a person's attention is focused. It turns out to be such a vicious circle. A person doesn't sleep because of constant thoughts, he's thinking all day long, and fear is increasing accordingly. As for fear, yes, Sasha, you're right, I agree. It's one of the strongest emotions. And the stronger the emotion is, the more vital energy consciousness takes from a person for itself. The data accumulated in literature over the last 20 years confirm the idea of one universal mechanism of the development of insomnia as a state of cerebral hyperactivation, regardless of its nature, whether it is primary or secondary. That's what we have talked about today, that many researchers actually, what does secondary mean? It means that if a person has a serious somatic chronic disease, then first of all, his insomnia is explained by the presence of this disease. So today, many people already start thinking, what is primary? Perhaps the mechanisms of insomnia are so destructive that they lead to the development of many diseases. And it turns out to be such an interesting situation. All day long, consciousness drives a person into one thing or another, then to a third one, creating an illusion which we ourselves choose and make these decisions, right? It would seem that at least at night, it should give us some rest. However, people often say, Lord, I wish these thoughts would leave me alone, at least at night. But they don't leave. That's the toxicity which you, Sasha, have mentioned. Understanding how important sleep is for personality, consciousness by any means takes away this opportunity from personality, tries to deprive personality of this possibility.
Right.
Yes, and here perhaps it is very interesting to talk about the ways by which consciousness is trying to take away sleep from a person. There are all sorts of, let's say, illnesses that cause sleep disorders. For example, restless leg syndrome, alien hand syndrome, cluster pain, and so on. These are illnesses that occur in response to certain somatic diseases, but the reasons for them haven't been found.
Thank you very much for mentioning these two syndromes. I really wanted to talk about them because I think they're very interesting. First of all, these syndromes themselves are very frightening. Today, they're not explained at all, not to mention clear understanding, and specialists don't understand the reason for them. They only observe how various brain structures change and how they're affected by these diseases. What is the restless leg syndrome, for example? It's when a person it's a nervous disorder that manifests itself in very unpleasant, even painful sensations in the lower extremities, more often in the lower extremities, and it is accompanied by a need to move, most often at night. This is what keeps a person awake. I mean, a person is not just far from reaching the phase of deep sleep. The thing is that this anxiety, these unpleasant sensations, and the need to move, because only then these painful syndromes begin to subside. People describe them as pressing, stabbing, or cutting, when blood boils in their legs, when legs get twisted. Hence, those are quite strong and unpleasant sensations. And when a person starts walking, they decrease, at least to some extent. Can you imagine what a mockery over a person this is? A person is even unable to go to sleep. Regarding the subject, I have found a very interesting description by a woman who has been suffering from the restless leg syndrome for many years. This is how she describes the state. The horror of the upcoming night and constant interruption of sleep has been going on for years. For many years, I could hardly fall asleep, even for a short time, because of the pain in my legs, which resembled an insect attack. Imagine having a swarm of bees under your skin that fly and sting you. It's really very painful. I have a constant urge to scratch my legs, get out of bed, and walk. It was impossible to lie down, even for a minute, because my legs were twitching all night uncontrollably. The symptoms were so painful that she didn't want to go to bed at night. She dreaded the approach of nighttime. What a state of horror and fear this is. As for me, I didn't know that this disorder is so widespread. It is interesting that one of London clinics, which specifically deals with this disease, provides statistics that 1 in 20 people suffer from it. Women are more likely than men, but from childhood, any age category is susceptible to it. The only thing is that after the age of 20 or 30, it all increases. Interestingly, the woman was treated at this clinic. She was prescribed medication. She said, the only thing they managed to achieve was that I had an hour and a half of interrupted sleep during the night. But she herself turned out to be a very curious person as she began to conduct such a self-study. She said, I noticed that if I somehow managed to switch my attention, for example, to listening to an audio recording or an interesting audio book or music that reduced this brain activity and helped me to relax a little, I was able to sleep for about 1.5 or 2 hours. This is the kind of respite I got, even though sleep was still superficial. This is such a painful state. If we turn to how they try to explain the restless leg syndrome, which can also be primary and secondary, it can be related to various diseases. Therefore, it is often not diagnosed, right? Vascular surgeons, endocrinologists, therapists, and neuropathologists receive complaints from patients that they have some problems, discomfort, and pain in the lower extremities. However, most often they cannot explain their cause, but they note that the most effective medications are those of the dopamine group, that is, agonists of dopamine receptors. They are the most effective. In other words, it turns out that the dopamine system is involved in the development of this disease. Dopamine is a hormone that is released by the hypothalamus. In this regard, I would like to read out a very interesting quote from the book Birds and a Stone by Anastasia Novik. Hypothalamus coordinates various forms of nervous activity, starting from wakefulness and sleep states, and up to generation of positive and negative emotions, to organisms' behavior during adaptation reactions. Now let's talk about the essentials. Exactly inside hypothalamus, there are 2 ancient centers. Looking at a cranium from above, you can imagine these centers making a peculiar internal triangle together with the pineal gland, where the pineal gland is the apex of this triangle. These centers were called differently in different times, but their essence never changed. One of the versions of their names mentioned in ancient manuscripts is agathodemon and kakodemon. Agathodemon stimulates generation of positive thoughts, while kakodemon stimulates generation of negative thoughts. Thoughts originate not directly from a cerebral substance called hypothalamus. They're born in the two centers which I've been talking about. These centers are certain chakrans of subtle matter which our thoughts consist of. These centers are sort of semiconductors between subtle matter and the nervous system. They receive signals from the nervous system, transferring them into subtle matter, and at the same time, they can encode information into a signal and, let's say, send mental orders via nervous tracts. I would add something you already know, namely that, upon stimulation of both positive and negative emotions, the activity of the parasympathetic section of the nervous system predominates, and one of the most important nerves of that section is the vagus nerve. But the master of all the internal is precisely the pineal gland. It's sort of a superior control organ which exerts its significant influence only when really serious changes occur inside a person. Yet, if there is nothing like that, the pineal gland only watches, and from time to time it controls the overall state of cerebral structures, adjusting operation of the brain. Moreover, what is interesting, this guard not just records a person's thoughts and deeds, but it also intensifies what predominates in his thoughts. Therefore, if you switch your attention to negative perception, the guard will support negativity in you, intensifying what you have. If you switch to the good, the guard will intensify these feelings in you. So it's interesting that exactly the hypothalamo-hypophyseal system regulates the processes of sleep and wakefulness in a body. It's an interesting piece of information, and if we add to it, well, we all know that there were times in the past, and even nowadays, there are people who fall asleep in a prayer addressed with gratitude to God, to the spiritual world, and they wake up in a prayer, starting their day with gratitude. These people live by the laws of conscience, while conscience is a characteristic of personality, a category of the spiritual world. Thus, such people live in harmony with conscience, in harmony with their soul. And it is interesting that these people don't have insomnia. They don't have a restless leg syndrome. They sleep peacefully. As for the alien hand syndrome, generally speaking, it is very interesting. It is also called, it's how the brain deprives a person of control over his body. It is probably one of very scary neurological syndromes. It's a frightening syndrome. It manifests itself in a phenomenon that most often the right hand becomes like a separate alien organ in a person and begins to behave unpredictably, totally uncontrollably, and very aggressively towards a person himself. Most often, it starts strangling him when a person tries to fall asleep. It just doesn't let him fall asleep. Moreover, this behavior is impossible to predict. Patients who have this syndrome describe that it all usually begins with a cooling sensation in their hand. People notice that their hand becomes very cold at first. Its skin darkens, dark stripes appear on it, meaning the skin color changes. Therefore, patients often say, "I've got a dead man's hand," or "an evil spirit has possessed my hand." That's what people themselves tell about it. I have found such descriptions of how this syndrome manifests itself. Generally speaking, these are like tics, extrapyramidal disorders that lead, for example, to various tic-like movements. They are typical in many diseases. Yet what is special about the alien hand syndrome? The fact that a person cannot control the movements of his hand in any way. It is something that exists separately from a person. It crawls over my body, over my cheek, or it suddenly appears behind my back and moves along the spine. Its movements are grasping and sweeping. For instance, it can overturn a glass when I'm being fed, or it snatches an apple from my other hand when I'm eating it. One of the patients described how her right leg had also become unpredictable. She said, "I got very scared at that moment. I screamed that I had a dead person's hand, and a dead person's leg appeared, not just the hand." By the way, what is the difference between the alien hand syndrome and the restless leg syndrome, which I have talked about? In many patients, it causes almost horror before the upcoming night. Hence, the alien hand syndrome differs from all other types of neurological disorders, those that are observed, exactly by the presence of very strong fear and anxiety, which is not observed in other types of similar disorders. I mean, fear and anxiety predominate. For instance, the cause of the alien hand syndrome is explained by a partial destruction of the corpus callosum. Thus, the connection between the two hemispheres gets disrupted and control is lost. However, in the beginning, I said that in our research, we would still seek to understand the causes of insomnia. We have mentioned that everything happening in the body is a consequence of the processes which take place at the energy level, at the level of interaction between field structures, at the level of interaction between consciousness and personality. Therefore, everything that happens in the body, everything that happens to the brain, is merely a consequence. By the way, the corpus callosum is very interesting, and various research has been carried out on studying it. One of the manifestations of dysfunction in the corpus callosum is when a person loses the ability to recognize what emotional state another person is in. He stops gaining experience in communication, the experience of interaction with other people. It's very difficult for such patients who have these disorders to establish any contact with other people at all. First of all, their social interaction is disrupted. Yet, what if we turn it the opposite way, okay? Perhaps it's just when a person chooses to live as an egoist for quite a long period of time under the dictation of his consciousness, meaning he is indifferent to the needs of people around him and puts his own needs first. Then he has problems with communication, with understanding other people. Maybe the long-term choice of such a behavior, such an attitude, exactly leads to a disorder in brain structures in particular. Thus, it's necessary to reverse it, to put it in the first place, to make an assumption. Obviously, that's how it happens. When for a very long time a person lives under the control of his consciousness, choosing those evil, negative messages that constantly come from it, he gets under the total control of secondary consciousness. Later on, secondary consciousness can reinforce this control in any way, in the form of either the alien hand syndrome or the restless leg syndrome or insomnia. When I was trying to rethink, to understand and figure all this out, I came up with the following understanding. Look, if the restless leg syndrome, well, why am I now interested in the restless leg and the alien hand syndromes? They both show very clearly that a person is unable to control his body. If I'm a body, I'm supposed to understand how it works and how to cope with it, right? But if we say that changes in the brain and brain activity is a consequence of the activity of consciousness, it means that consciousness controls this process. Science asserts that I am consciousness. In this case, I should definitely subdue this situation and know how to get out of it. But it's not working. And even people who purposefully study these syndromes from such a perspective don't find a solution. However, if I begin to study all this from the perspective of personality, it becomes clear to me. Moreover, I'm protected from both the restless leg syndrome and the alien hand syndrome. I know how to handle insomnia. So it turns out that I'm the one whose nature I can study. I'm the one who can control the situation because only personality can control it. I do have this experience, and I know what insomnia is. It was present in my life. I know what a sleepless night is. As a physician, for years I have watched a large number of people with and without mental disorders who have insomnia, and I know how cruel these manifestations are. Yet, when I was observing and trying to figure it out from the standpoint of consciousness and science, it just didn't work. Everything we could provide was medication, which means offering a person to become addicted to drugs, because all sleeping pills lead a person to addiction, but don't solve this problem. But when I began to study this phenomenon, look at it and understand its nature from the position of personality, I first of all got rid of insomnia myself, and now I know how to get away from it, and we're going to share this today. Hence, it turns out that I am my true nature, the only true one, the one that allows me to understand everything, allows me to manage situations in my life. This understanding, among other things, led me to...
This basically confirms the words from the video Consciousness and Personality, that we can only study the system
Yes, only outside the system.
when we are outside the system. Very well. And you know, all these syndromes are new to me. I've never heard of any of them, but it is very striking. It exactly shows how consciousness mocks and makes fun of people, totally shamelessly and unceremoniously.
There's another thing that is really important for me. Today, we have already mentioned the healing power of love. However, people have lost faith in this healing power. Yet look, I am personality. I can pay attention either to love, meaning constantly give attention to the soul, or I can pay attention to these evil programs of consciousness. So how can I be protected? If my attention is always focused on the soul and love, I cannot have a restless leg syndrome, an alien hand syndrome, or insomnia. I am protected. This very power of love protects me because I give my attention to it. I'm filled with it. Love eliminates any evil and simply removes it from life. As a matter of fact, everything is very simple.
Darkness cannot approach light.
Darkness cannot approach light.
Then what is angel? An angel is precisely the one who feels. It is the angel who perceives this world under dictation of consciousness. He doesn't see it, but he feels. And the inner component, the feeling part, is exactly what many people in Universal Grain video were talking about, yes? It is that inner perception through feelings. It is perceived holistically and differently, not as through consciousness. But it is very simple to find and liberate this angel. And it is very simple to realize that you are, pardon me, a personality, but not a part of the program with these written zeros and ones. This means to start forbidding your consciousness to impose on what you don't need, to impose system directives. That is bad thoughts, bad deeds, and everything evil. And once you start falling asleep happily, you'll be waking up happily too. In the beginning, of course, as many people know from their experience, as they are telling, yes, they hold on in the daytime, but at night thoughts come which dictate. Well, it's just in the beginning. When a person intensifies his work on himself, then what happens at night as well?
If something predominates in him, this is exactly what happens.
Perfectly true. That is, even at night,
He goes to God.
he goes to God, and no one can overpower, because it's in fact very simple to avoid a program. The only necessary thing is what? To make a bit of effort. But that is exactly the point. If a person doesn't make efforts, if he doesn't feel, whereas everyone can feel, only afterwards deadening and rejecting in oneself everything divine. Why does he reject? Because consciousness dictates. It is beneficial for consciousness that a human becomes a subpersonality, or speaking in religious terms, that he goes to hell. Why? Because consciousness continues to exist with him. The program continues working. While the program self-identifies, we have already talked about this more than once, it perceives itself as I. That's why a person has multiple I. Well, everything is very simple. And it turns out that it's beneficial for consciousness that a human becomes a subpersonality, while for a personality this is death. It's not beneficial. This is a constant slavery, you are constantly being used. But many people may say, why don't I feel myself as a personality? But you do feel yourself as a personality, that's the trouble. Everyone can feel oneself. This oppression, this inner suffering, it is you as a personality who feels this. Whereas all your avarice, all your anger and everything negative that you've accumulated, that is what consciousness is. And many people also say, it's too late to re-educate myself, even a simple method. To start thinking about what is good. Just make your consciousness think only about good and finance only good things, whereas brush aside everything bad, don't think about it. They say, it's too late to re-educate myself. I have already grown up, I've already kind of formed. Who is speaking at this moment? It is consciousness speaking. While this person is in pridefulness, it seems to him that he is thinking correctly, reprimanding everyone, lecturing. This is a convenient position for consciousness, whereas in fact neither age matters nor anything else matters. Any person can do it at any time. If you embarked on the path, then stand on it. Work every day, all the time. This doesn't hinder either intellectual activity if you are a researcher. This doesn't prevent you from working with your hands if you work with your hands. It hinders absolutely nothing. Just hold on and don't let unnecessary thoughts in. Thoughts should work, meaning fulfill everything related to work and serve you. That is, first of all, you must become an angel inside yourself. That is, a master over your beast, while the beast should work for you.
How can a person with sleep disorders get a chance to have enough sleep? We understand that there can be various situations in life. Sometimes, for one reason or another, we have to stay awake for 24 hours. For example, if a person is on duty or in a stressful situation in which he unfortunately lives and stays up all night until the issue is resolved and so on. There are, let's say, transitory disorders or changes, and here it's important to understand that if a person has had such an episode and there are no irregularities in his body, then his physiology will work, and the body will compensate this situation independently, extending the time of sleep, and the person will have enough sleep during the next sleep episode, and later on, no disorder or difficulties occur in his life. However, there is also a very interesting point here. People who are sometimes prone to conscious deprivation in order to increase productivity and so on try to sleep little during the working week, but work a lot in the hope that they will sleep off on the weekend. This is quite a serious substitution, because when such a situation happens, a person sleeps off on the weekends in order to compensate for the lack of sleep on weekdays. It harms the body no less than if he doesn't get enough sleep, even perhaps to a greater extent, because such oversleeping leads to disruption of the work and working rhythms of the body as a whole. Certain endocrine shifts occur which lead to excess body weight, excessive accumulation of cholesterol, and malfunction of the body as a whole. And such rhythmic episodes of a lack of sleep and oversleeping also have significant negative consequences. In this regard, there is an illustrative example when physicians themselves were puzzled by this question and studied young and physically healthy doctors. Thus, they experimented on themselves. It happened in Hong Kong. Some of the doctors were those who worked only day shifts, while some worked both day and night shifts. And the following situation was revealed. Again, they studied the structure of DNA and what happened to DNA, since it may be considered a marker of a possible development of chronic diseases and cancer in the future. So it turned out that people who had night shifts and 24-hour shifts and who didn't sleep at night had about 30% more DNA damage. Furthermore, it was noticed that one 24-hour shift was enough to increase the amount of damaged DNA by 25% compared to those physicians who had a normal sleep. What does this mean? It means that for people who have such periods of sleep and wakefulness when they don't sleep due to their profession, the risk of chronic diseases and cancer increases by 25 to 30%. These are quite serious numbers.
These are very high numbers.
That's the price of insomnia. Therefore, attempts to treat sleep disorders are often weird. Nonetheless, such attempts have always been made. People intuitively understood that a pretty serious problem is hidden behind it, and used all kinds of techniques and methods in order to fall asleep. Yet, the simplest thing they talk about is sleep hygiene, meaning that people should fall asleep at the same time, in the same place, that one's bed should only be for sleeping. It is not recommended to watch TV before going to bed, and so on. There are even the following recommendations. If you go to bed but cannot fall asleep within 10 minutes, you should get up and do something. Recommendations also include outdoor walks and elimination of hard physical activity right before bedtime. I mean walking and so on, but not right before going to bed. Also, a person shouldn't overeat before bedtime. These are such trivial recommendations which should have helped to get a good peaceful sleep. Yes, in certain situations they can help. If a person develops certain rhythms and his body gets used to these rhythms of life, it is clear that he will fall asleep at this time. However, life is not what we got used to. It is actually not as superficial as we think. Therefore, simple sleep hygiene doesn't solve the problem. So, the question of medical support arose.
However, consciousness focuses on the external in any case, either change the conditions and create whole rituals.
Exactly. The word rituals has now come to my mind too. Because all these outdoor walks in the fresh air, some herbal infusions, fragrances.
Starting with simple tea drinking. Absolutely right, ritual actions. I especially like the recommendation to reduce mental activity. At the same time, consciousness creates a lot of programs that focus attention, such as computer games, and immediately offers a lot of gadgets. People's attention is focused on the necessity to constantly work with them.
As a
right?
matter of fact, a modern person lives in a very aggressive information environment. I mean, information presses from all sources. Let's be honest, and it's not a secret to anyone that most people fall asleep
Yes, absolutely right.
holding their favorite gadgets in front of their faces. Hence, what kind of rest and compliance with all these instructions can we talk about? As I understand, the consumer society has found a very good way out of.
Yes, the magic pill.
Is this one pill enough?
It's not enough. Even if we look at the history of sleeping pills, starting with phenobarbital and the first attempts to solve the problem of sleep, all these attempts, later, somewhere in the 1960s, the era of tranquilizers began. All the history of these sleeping pills has led to what? To the fact that they cause the strongest drug addiction, that they usually don't restore the physiological sleep of a person, but create an even bigger problem. Besides, sleeping pills have numerous side effects which are also associated with fatal outcome caused by an overdose. This is very simple. The uncontrolled, dose-dependent effect is such a very subtle line.
Inhibition of the respiratory center.
Yes, absolutely. Up to respiratory arrest, anything can be there. And mental disorders, even now. And I don't want to go deeper. I mean, it's not a solution. Where did they look next? Towards melatonin. Since the pineal gland and the hypothalamic pituitary system are involved in the regulation of sleep and wakefulness, they clearly saw the regularity and interconnection that there is such a hormone as melatonin, which regulates sleep and wakefulness cycles. And they came to the following conclusion: let's invent melatonin-based drugs. But here, among the few, I have found one of those correct comments from physicians who are thoughtful about it. Guys, let's remember that this hormone is produced by the gland, which is located in the very center of the brain, and is currently very poorly studied. Similarly, we still don't fully understand the actions of those hormones which are produced by this gland, while it produces not only melatonin, and how they actually interact.
This point is very interesting. Human body has such an interconnection, which is called the feedback principle. If an organ produces a substance, in this case, we're talking about the gland that produces a hormone. And if this hormone comes from the external environment, then its own hormone starts to be produced in smaller quantities. That is, roughly speaking, our body is very lazy. Why would it produce anything that comes from the outside? So here we have a very interesting situation. The more melatonin-based medication we take, the less amount of its own melatonin the pineal gland will produce. And since there will be less of it, there will be less need in tissues. Therefore, these pediocytes, which are located in the tissues of the gland that produces melatonin, will not function, and since there is no need in them, they will begin to atrophy. While we do know that the pineal gland influences formation of the so-called circadian rhythms, at least. Circadian rhythms are the rhythms of sleep and wakefulness. Accordingly, when we take melatonin-based medications, we cause atrophy of the organ that regulates our sleep.
On a regular basis. Thus, we deprive our body of this function.
Yes, and we don't just take it away from the body,
Destroy it.
but we destroy it without an opportunity to restore this function later,
Right.
in case we cancel this medication. Therefore, total atrophy occurs, and we have no idea where it's going to lead. Why? Because the pineal gland is quite a complex organ. But it's not just a complex organ. Diana has already said that the pineal gland functions not only as a gland, but also as a connecting link.
That's why I would really like to refer to another quote from the book Birds and a Stone regarding the pineal gland. Inhabitants of ancient China and Tibet knew about the pineal gland as well. By the way, in these lands, from time immemorial, there existed a ritual of cremation of deceased high-ranked clergymen, after which their closest disciples looked for the so-called rinxel. It's a hard substance resembling a little amber pebble. By its size, disciples judged what spiritual level their teacher had achieved. It was believed that the larger the rinxel was, the higher the deceased person had been spiritually. Yet rinxel is nothing other than the brain sand of the pineal gland. This sand still remains one of the biggest mysteries for contemporary scientists, although people in ancient Tibet knew it as a place of psychic energy accumulation. The one who wants to can always find this knowledge inside himself, and at any time, regardless of the general level of education among humanity. What people are now trying to do jointly by means of their science is, to put it mildly, a mere attempt to reach the left ear with the right hand. It's a little complicated, yet so entertaining. The ancients knew a shorter way through their internal. After all, the whole point is not about reaching the ear, but rather about comprehending what this organ is and how to use it. For an individual, it's always more important to get through his or her internal instead of observing the external in confusion. There have always been plenty of tools to cultivate one's spiritual. Just choose whatever you like. Yet working with these tools, one way or another, a person always reached the same result: stimulation of the pineal gland by growing of the power of love and surmounting the animal nature, the ancient dragon, meaning the hypothalamus, in himself. So the pineal gland is not just the master of the human body, but also a gate to the spiritual world, sort of a portal. Therefore, any change in the state of consciousness is controlled by the pineal gland. It turns out that once again we're returning to love, that the most natural stimulation of the pineal gland for a person is cultivation of love.
By the way, there is a very interesting fact about the grains of brain sand. In polarized light, these grains of brain sand manifest by effringence with the formation, attention, of the Maltese cross. Those who watched the Night of the Spirit video know very well what this symbol represents and who was worthy of wearing it. Guys, if you haven't seen it, please watch this video. I believe that your puzzle pieces can be put together
Into a full picture.
let's say, into a more complete picture. And let's say the widespread understanding that the pineal gland is the third eye will expand. Thus, you will be able to find literature and sources that will expand your understanding of this organ and its function in a human body and in a person's spiritual development.
Yes, lately, a lot of attention is being paid to this gland in physics, particularly in quantum physics. Those who are interested can also look for information about how this gland is viewed, what place is given to these grains of sand, and why these grains of sand attract so much attention of those who want to study the quantum interaction of humans and the surrounding world. This topic is very profound, and even avid atheists are forced to think that there are really many things in spiritual practices, spiritual studies, and religions which have physics as a foundation.
Wonderful. During today's program, we have touched upon physics more than once. And it seems to me that by expanding the horizons of the study of consciousness, we turn to other fields of science. Perhaps it would be interesting to invite physicists here someday, ask them the same questions,
And to understand how much these two sciences have in common.
and find all these interactions. As a matter of fact, I'm at least highly interested. I don't know what about you. Okay, now tell me please. We have talked in general about the meaning of sleep for a human being. Here I consider a human being solely holistically. We have also talked about the phenomenon of insomnia, meaning that it is clearly determined as the action of secondary consciousness.
Manifestation of its dominant activity.
We have talked about the consequences it can lead to and how harmful it is for a person. We have talked about the methods of modern treatment that are now being used, starting from simple recommendations, sleep hygiene, and ending with medications. Okay, please tell me what to do.
There is a simple solution to this problem. Schultz's autogenic training that is done when a person wakes up and at night before falling asleep. I mean, at least twice a day or more, as many times as you want. However, I'd like to say but right away. Only personality is able to control this process, because if a person continues to associate himself with consciousness, consciousness will not allow him to perform autogenic training. Even the most determined ones don't do it longer than 2 weeks. Moreover, with interruptions. Under any pretext, consciousness won't let a person do it. It will not allow him to ruin the program it is building. That's impossible. Therefore, first of all, it is necessary to admit that I am a personality. I am a spiritual being, just like each of us. Human nature is joy. Really, even after the topic of insomnia, when I studied it from a different standpoint, I thought, do I still want to be a part of this evil structure, so aggressive, so ruthless towards a human? Don't I want to accept my true nature, the nature of joy, the nature of love? Of course, it's the choice of every person, but there has to be an understanding that only personality can solve this problem in such a simple and effective way. Only personality is able to control this process. There is no other way.
I would like to support Diana's words. Why? Because I've had quite a serious experience in my life when I practiced autogenic training without this foundation, the spiritual foundation, without realizing that I was personality. As it often happens when there is a huge flow of information, as it was in the early 1990s, some information becomes available. It so happened that I had a fairly close encounter with a person who studied Oriental practices. He was teaching autogenic training, and there was a stage called self-regulation. At this stage, we were taught how to sleep properly and efficiently. As a matter of fact, we were taught techniques that were designed to allow us to stay awake or sleep for certain periods of time without harming our health, and thus to use that time efficiently for ourselves. Roughly speaking, I won't go into techniques. Every 4 hours, you switch off for 15 to 20 minutes. This isn't an ordinary sleep. It's a sleep that occurs as a result of autogenic training. It may be called sleep only conventionally. And this way, you can work for an unlimited time, sort of without harming your body. What did this practice lead to? It led to quite an interesting experience. In the beginning, it seemed like everything was fine, everything was great. You switch off every 4 hours for 15 to 20 minutes. With this switching off, you don't have to lie down and fall asleep. You enter a certain state, and while being in this state, you can perform simple actions. Roughly speaking, you can walk down the street. You can, for instance, wash dishes or mop the floor. I mean, you perform some simple actions, giving yourself a command to do them. At this time, your brain is resting. Because of my persistence, it lasted quite a long time, more than a year. Yes, indeed. During my studies at the university, I felt great while taking final exams. How was that? Here they are, exams are around the corner, and in 1 or 2 days I mastered information that I hadn't learned for a year. Although a question arises, what did you do for a whole year? Why couldn't you master all that in time? Thus, I began to notice simple and interesting things behind it. Indeed, the body seemed to be resting, but I started getting an oppressive feeling that I was deprived of something. And even though my body seemed to be energetic and I was sort of learning the information, but, as we have discussed, when a person doesn't sleep for a long time, he loses critical perception of what is really happening, and his reaction decreases. I began to notice that even though the information was absorbed worse, and the amount of processed information became smaller, there was a feeling of a kind of euphoria, that I seemed to be able to do more than others. It was a false feeling because, in fact, I turned out to be losing more. The last point in this story was that my body also began to malfunction. I mean that a normal, healthy, physically strong young man all of a sudden started having hypertensive crises. So roughly speaking, having given all this up, I quickly returned to normal sleep. But of course, there was no such thing as sleeping it off. The body was readjusting anyway, and after a while, sleep returned to normal. Yet the most interesting thing was that these abilities of memorization and analysis got quickly restored, as in a hungry animal that grabbed the food after it hadn't been fed for a long time. The ability to memorize information from the first time and to learn it more clearly was restored quite fast. Fortunately, I got away from that. This is just a confirmation of the fact that if you don't perceive yourself as personality, if you have no desire for spiritual development, then these tools are destructive for a person in all aspects and for his personality as well.
I'd like to share another story and observation of mine. We have already mentioned that our awakening, recovery from sleep, occurs through images in the phase of REM sleep. These are the brightest dreams. Very often, we already begin to feel that we're waking up, and we see these ghastly, meaningless dreams. But we cannot wake up. Please, 2 more minutes, 5 more minutes. The alarm clock has already gone off. It is very important to get up right away, to interrupt this dream, interrupt this viewing, because I've observed myself how it happens. Okay, 2 more minutes, 5 more minutes, and you end up falling asleep for another 20 minutes. Later on, when you get up, there is such an interesting state. You get up, and wherever you look, whomever you talk to, at home in the morning, a plate that hasn't been washed, everything annoys you. There is a flow of complaints and aggression which is completely dominant. Somebody hasn't done something. You recall some problems with a conversation that took place yesterday or the day before. Thus, your attitude itself is very aggressive and full of complaints. If you know how consciousness works, the way out is very simple. So what do? I just sit down and write it all out in my notebook, and I leave that aggression there along with the written thoughts. After that, I do autogenic training and relaxation. I perform meditative and spiritual practices. That's it, and I get rid of that state right away. However, people seek assistance. For example, a woman recently came and said, "You know, I have a family, 2 little kids and a husband. Basically, I love all of them. I grew up and was brought up in a family where my mother got up before the others in the morning, and I do the same. Certainly, I should help my kids get ready for school, prepare clothes, and cook breakfast for my husband. I seem to treat my duties normally, but when I go to wake them up, I already hate them," she says. "Is something wrong with me? I'm scared. I guess there's something wrong with me, especially lately." We began discussing it. How does she wake up? She says, "Oh, my husband is always angry even with that. When the alarm clock goes off, I hit snooze 2 or 3 times, turn to the other side, and continue sleeping. And how do you wake up? Oh, the dreams are so stupid sometimes. Then she started learning to write down thoughts, and she understood the reason. While she's ironing and preparing clothes for her kids, while she's making breakfast for the family, the following thoughts come to her. I'm just a slave. I get up before everybody else. They're all sleeping, but I have to. This way, day after day, until I get all of them ready, and I have no time left for myself. In what condition will she go to wake them up? She says, my kids are little. I should come and wake the child up gently and softly. But I rush into the room and say, okay, quickly, you have 5 minutes, here are your tights, here's everything. And when I come to wake my husband up, every time he opens his eyes and asks frightenedly, what's wrong? That's the kind of look I have on my face. Once we discussed these mechanisms with her, everything became clear. When she looked at it from a completely different standpoint, her situation began to change. All this indicates that if we feel that we're waking up, if the alarm clock goes off and we don't want this dominant activity of consciousness, the aggressive activity of consciousness, to enter our day and begin to control it, it is very important to get up right away. To wake up, get up, make the body sit, to do autogenic training, because only personality can make the body sit and do autogenic training. This is a very important point.
Another important point is not just to wake up, to rise and sit, but also to feel love, to have this feeling. A person should fall asleep and wake up with a feeling of love. The first thought that should come to your mind has to be about love. If you wake up, and it doesn't matter what kind of picture your consciousness has shown you, how passionate or scary your dream was, just get up, push it all aside, and feel love as your very first feeling. This is extremely important. Then everything else will work out, as they say.
Right. And this is, by the way, a recommendation from an expert who works in a clinic. This is what he says. And this is actually the first thing to do if we talk about sleep hygiene. It has been voiced today, and it was written about a long time ago. In many holy scriptures, it is mentioned how to go to sleep in the right way, in love.
And to wake up with this feeling.
To go to sleep in love, and to wake up with love. I would like to finish our meeting with a parable. You can judge for yourselves on how it is related to sleep. And also, guys, if you have any questions regarding any subjects that have been discussed, or those that you are interested in, please comment under this video. We will happily reply to your questions, or we'll invite an expert from a different field in order to try to figure this out together. Thanks a lot to you again. In conclusion, let me tell you the parable. A monk who was on the path of spiritual development fell asleep. While he was sleeping, he had a dream where he got into heaven. He was in heaven and saw all his brothers and his teacher there, who were all meditating. He was surprised, and indignation arose in him. He said, "How come? Why? This is heaven. Why is heaven not different from what I am doing on earth? My brothers and I are meditating there. But where is it? Where is heaven?" And he heard a voice thereafter. Do you believe they are in heaven? Actually, heaven is in them. So, guys, in order to avoid insomnia, obsessive thoughts and depression, cultivate heaven in yourselves while you are here. Thank you all, and see you soon.